Welcome to Summit Panel number 6, focused on bridging the valley of death, lessons learned from the eVTOL technology domain, from capital engagement and prototyping. We have three papers that are being presented today. The first paper is entitled Navigating the Valley of Death, Lessons for Defense Acquisition from Transitioning Electrical Vertical Takeoff and Landing Technologies in the U.S. Air Force. Our presenter is Jim Mignano. Jim will be followed by Dr. Jerry McGinn. Jerry's paper is entitled Beyond Industrial Policy, How Engaging Capital Markets Can Help Our Industrial Base to Scale. And finally, we have Stephanie Halcro and Anna Kim, who will talk to the topic of prototyping, and their paper is entitled From Breakthroughs to the Battlefield, Best Practices for Tapping into the Power of Prototyping. Each of the papers will be presented for no more than 15 minutes. And after the 45 minutes of presentations, we'll have time for discussion, questions from the audience, and I look forward to it. So with that, let me turn it over to Jim. Jim, are you ready for your briefing?
I am. Thank you, Dr. Verma.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jim Mignano, PhD student and assistant policy researcher at RAND. My co-author and mentor, Dr. Lauren Mayer, is also on the line and will be available for discussion after my presentation. Today, I'll share findings from recent RAND work that highlights ways to better transition emerging commercial technologies into operational use, especially when there's no initial capability sponsorship. Our work focuses on electric vertical takeoff and landing, or eVTOL technologies. Originally developed for commercial markets, these aircraft show potential military uses such as personnel transport, logistics resupply, and medical evacuation. The eVTOL case highlights both the challenges and the opportunities of bridging the valley of death in defense acquisition, where promising technologies often stall between R&D and a program of record. I'll begin by framing the research question with the next slide. Our central question is, how can defense organizations bridge the valley of death without initial capability sponsorship? This question gets to a core tension in defense innovation. The DoD increasingly seeks to adopt cutting-edge commercial technologies, but defense acquisitions traditionally begin with a sponsored capability, which can be difficult for emerging commercial technologies to secure. Some innovations, like eVTOLs, do not yet align with the capability gap, creating a sort of chicken and egg problem. It can be difficult to obtain capability sponsorship without first demonstrating value through experimentation. But at the same time, it can also be difficult for emerging commercial technologies to access experimentation without alignment to a sponsored capability. Our work examines how emerging commercial technologies can navigate this challenge. Using the case of eVTOLs in the Air Force, we explore what alternative routes are available when a promising technology doesn't align neatly with an initial capability gap, and how the DoD can better exploit those routes to avoid losing out on innovation. Next, I'll outline the case by presenting the specific challenges the Air Force has faced considering eVTOLs. eVTOLs offer a timely and instructive case study. These aircraft are being developed for commercial applications like air taxis and logistics delivery, but they also have potential military uses. That said, eVTOLs face several obstacles to transition, challenges common to many emerging commercial technologies. First, they do not align with an existing capability gap. When we conducted our study, no Air Force Major Command had formally identified a requirement that eVTOLs would fill. That's not because they lack potential, but because the operational need hadn't been clearly defined or validated, making it difficult to prioritize them in budgets or acquisition plans. As a consequence, eVTOLs face limited options without capability sponsorship. Capability sponsorship, or formal backing by an authorized organization tied to a capability gap, is required for most structured acquisition pathways. Without it, technologies like eVTOLs remain stuck outside the system. Third, there are disincentives to sponsorship. Even with some stakeholders interested in eVTOLs, taking on the role of sponsor is a time and resource-intensive process. With tight budgets and pressing demands, many organizations are understandably cautious about championing emerging, unproven capabilities. Fourth, there's uncertainty in moving from experimentation to acquisition. Efforts like AFWERX Agility Prime have tested eVTOLs through demonstrations and simulations, but there's no standardized path from pilot to program of record. Without a sponsor or follow-on plan, these efforts risk losing momentum. Fifth, the Air Force has limited influence over commercial design. The Air Force is a relatively small customer in the global eVTOL market, giving it little leverage to shape platform designs. Defense-specific needs, like secure communications or ruggedization, aren't built in by default, and retrofitting them later can be costly and complicated. And sixth, there are supply chain and security risks. Many eVTOL firms are gearing toward global supply chains. As they scale, production may move overseas or involve less reliable components, raising concerns about system security, long-term supportability, and compliance with defense standards. These 6 challenges explain why, despite growing interest, eVTOLs have not yet found a viable transition path into Air Force operations. They also underscore the importance of flexible, non-traditional routes, especially when a technology lacks initial capability sponsorship. So the findings I'm presenting today draw from 2 RAND reports, which you can find online by searching the report numbers on this slide. Full references are also included at the end of this presentation. Next, I'll discuss our work mapping out how emerging technologies can move forward, even without a capability sponsor. The eVTOL case doesn't just reveal barriers. It also helps us think more clearly about the options that are available, even when a technology doesn't start with capability sponsorship. To identify those options, we reviewed statutory authorities, DoD and Air Force policies, and flexible tools like other transactions and commercial solutions openings. We examined past transition cases, both successful and unsuccessful, and we held discussions with stakeholders across the Department of the Air Force. That work led us to map out possible transition routes, which I'll present in detail shortly. It shows how an emerging commercial technology might move from initial interest to operational deployment. We found that these flexible routes can do more than just enable early testing and experimentation. They can also help build an evidence base that over time may support future capability sponsorship or large-scale acquisition. I'll walk you through the diagram of these routes on the next slide. So let's begin where a technology enters this model. You'll see 4 entry points labeled A through D. Entry A on the lower left starts with a validated capability gap and a formal sponsorship from a major command or equivalent authority. This opens the most transition routes, but it can be difficult to secure. The remaining entry points don't require a capability sponsor and are more accessible for emerging commercial technologies. In our Air Force example, subordinate organizations such as bases and wings can use these routes. Entry B involves small-scale commercial purchases, where a few units might be purchased to test in real-world conditions or even immediately deploy. Entry C focuses on prototyping, supported by flexible mechanisms like OTs, and allows for adapting, refining, and demonstrating for defense-specific needs. And Entry D is experimentation, conducted under live or simulated conditions, often through cooperative R&D agreements or efforts such as Agility Prime. The shaded boxes represent key waypoints a technology might pass through to eventual deployment. These don't necessarily follow a fixed sequence, and they can be revisited as a technology matures. Finally, solid lines indicate routes that do not require capability sponsorship, which are especially relevant for technologies like eVTOLs. So what does this model tell us? First, multiple viable routes exist even without sponsorship. Promising technologies can start small and build an evidence base through incremental progress, testing feasibility, refining requirements, and laying the groundwork for future sponsorship. For example, our work identified two particularly feasible routes for eVTOLs. Entry B, where an Air Force organization could buy, lease, or acquire as a service a few eVTOLs for operational testing at the deploy small-scale waypoint. Test results could inform next steps, including resuming entry A, C, or D, with the intent to deploy at large scale. Alternatively, entry D, where an Air Force organization could partner with industry to conduct experimentation without purchasing the technology. Results from experimentation could unlock waypoints such as capability sponsorship, defense unique prototyping, and production for large-scale deployment. Second, prototyping and experimentation are central. These aren't just R&D activities. They're essential mechanisms for building credibility, demonstrating value, and maturing commercial tech for defense use. They allow technologies to iterate and evolve in response to operational feedback. And third, flexible acquisition authorities such as OTs, CSOs, and procurement for experimentation are critical enablers, especially important when traditional routes are unavailable. In short, this model reframes transition as a network of possible routes, not a single pipeline. For technologies like eVTOLs, it clarifies where opportunities exist and where additional support may be needed to bridge the valley of death. On the next slide, I'll tie this together and conclude with our recommendations. So from our analysis, both of the eVTOL case and broader acquisition practices, we identified several key findings about how emerging commercial technologies can be transitioned more effectively into military use. First, feasible transition routes do exist even without a capability sponsor. 3 entry points stand out as particularly promising. These entry points don't require initial alignment with a capability gap, but can unlock routes to deployment. Used strategically, they can also generate the data, operational feedback, and momentum needed to build a case for potential future sponsorship. Second, flexible mechanisms are critical enablers of these routes. These include OTs, CSOs, and adaptive prototyping and incremental funding approaches. These mechanisms help defense organizations bypass traditional regulatory hurdles and engage with firms that might otherwise remain outside the defense industrial base. As the pace of technological innovation accelerates and defense organizations increasingly turn to emerging commercial technologies, it is imperative to address barriers and create new routes for transition. Recent executive orders on acquisition reform emphasize the need for modernization, and our findings can inform the way forward in answering these directives. Based on these findings, we offer 3 recommendations. First, explore new routes and mitigate remaining barriers. DoD should expand alternative transition pathways while minimizing regulatory, procedural, and cultural barriers that discourage adoption of commercial technologies. This could include creating new mechanisms to unlock additional routes and examining existing authorities and policies to support current routes. Second, refine this transition model and raise awareness. The model we've presented is a starting point. It can be tailored to different organizations and technology areas. Tracking long-term outcomes, developing best practices, and sharing them across the acquisition community are natural next steps, especially given the growing emphasis on commercial innovation in recent executive orders and departmental guidance. Third, leverage these insights to better exploit available tools. Greater use of pilot programs, iterative acquisition strategies, and flexible funding models can enable gradual progress, testing, and adjustment before committing to full-scale acquisition. Taken together, these steps can help the DoD more effectively harness commercial innovation, especially in cases where promising technologies fall outside the traditional requirements process. The next slide concludes our presentation. So to recap, eVTOL technologies offer an instructive case of a commercially driven innovation with military potential, but without a clear path to transition. Our work maps out alternative routes that don't rely on early capability sponsorship and shows how existing tools like OTs and CSOs can be used more deliberately. We welcome your questions, reactions, and ideas, especially on how these insights might apply to other emerging technologies or to your own acquisition experiences. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Over to you, Jerry. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dinesh. Hi, everyone. Hey, I want to talk to you about my paper, Beyond Industrial Policy, How Engaging Capital Markets Can Help Our Industrial Base Scale. 2 clicks, please. All right, so there's the 2 major themes going on in the defense industrial base right now. One is very present in this conference and with the administration priorities about fostering innovation to speed deliver capabilities. And the second is around the increased use of industrial policy, which is all the rage, and I'll talk about that. So click. Despite these efforts, however, weaknesses abound in the defense industrial base. The challenges on delivering weapons systems to Ukraine, on the lack of stockpiles and sources available for Taiwan scenarios is very, very clear. So that leads us to our research question. 2 clicks. Is how effective have industrial policy efforts been, and what types of incentive structures would change private sector investment in defense? So our approach to get after this research question, so next click, was to examine current R&D incentive models to look at the rise and the limitations of industrial policy. And that led us to 2 clicks to identify new models for industry incentives to invest in scaling national security capabilities. So looking at it, one more click, looking at current R&D trends. On the left, you see the orange is private sector R&D, and the blue is federal. You'll see this is not a new chart, but the trend is important. So back in the 60s, federal R&D spend was by far the higher, about 2% of GDP and 70% of all research and development. Some of the outputs of that were GPS and stealth. But you see today it's inverted. You have business, private sector R&D is up 70% of the all R&D and up to 2.5% of GDP. And that's where you got your iPhones and the like. So 2 more clicks. 2 other aspects of the R&D market today is one is this focus on stock buybacks, which is controversial in a lot of circles. But we've written on this separately that the issue for capital allocation for publicly held companies is they have to invest their free cash flow in the best return for their shareholders. Now, what we can do instead of berating CEOs is give them more growth opportunities, more frequency and volume of competitions, or margin improvements. Next. IRAD is another area where there's been talk about the need to increase independent research and development. IRAD is available for traditional companies, those that have cost accounting standards, and there have been a couple efforts in the past 10 years or so to increase government and industry coordination on R&D and IRAD. I think we could do a lot better in terms of IRAD reviews. So next. So looking at the industrial policy, when I was in the building and oversaw Title III and IBAS, that's the Defense Production Act Title III, and the Industrial Base Analysis and Sustainment Program, Title III was about $50 to $7 per million per year, and IBAS was under 20. And as you can see, those were the small on the bottom, the small ones on the left. But then it spiked up during COVID. $1 billion went into Title III. And since then, we've had significant spends in the hundreds of millions of dollars in both programs on things like rare earth processing and the specialty metals and chemicals and the like. And the impacts of these have been significant. There's been the government investment, but one thing that hasn't been talked about as much, and one of the things that's critical about these industrial-based investments, is how do they impact your overall kind of marketplace? How do these companies that build these capabilities, how are they able to compete in the global marketplace? Because a lot of these capabilities left the United States because the market forces, and those market forces haven't gone away. So it's heartening to see some of these follow-on investments, such as MP Materials, the largest rare earth mine in the U.S., based in Mountain Pass, California. They've signed on long-term supply agreements with General Motors for rare earth magnets. They've received a separate loan from the Department of Energy to help increase their production facility in Texas. Imperion X, which is a titanium supplier, after a Title III investment, they've signed a framework agreement with the United Stars to supply titanium to these defense primes, Lockheed, Boeing, and BAE. Fortune Materials is a Canadian company, and they received a Title III investment. And at the same time, they also received a concurrent Canadian government investment. So it's good to see kind of the bilateral kind of investment efforts there to build that capacity. And then finally, there have been a couple efforts to build sort of functional capabilities. So they've, outside of Navy Crane in Indiana, they're building a munitions campus, which is the whole idea is to be a supply chain ecosystem for companies involved in munitions supply chain. And you've had a JV between Kratos and Rafael serve as the anchor tenant for that effort, and a bunch of suppliers have agreed to join. So the key with these efforts is getting them to be sustainable, so they're not having continuing government investment. However, these are some good examples, but one thing that needs to happen is having more of a sustained kind of effort to track these industrial-based investments and their impacts over time. So next. Industrial policy has increased, in other areas. Two big efforts during the prior administration. One was the Inflation Reduction Act, which resulted in $500 million in Defense Production Act Title III spending for Department of Energy and Department of Defense. This was a controversial effort because it was not bipartisan. It was done just by one party, and they invoked DPA for use of in solar cells and heat pumps, which many felt were not defense or national emergency kind of criteria. And so when the current administration came in January of this year, they canceled those executive orders and those projects. So those efforts have been suspended. So next. CHIPS is a different story, the CHIPS and Science Act. First of all, it's huge. It's the largest kind of use of industrial policy through appropriations in our lifetimes, and $52 billion of grants, loans, Defense Production Act funds, and the like. It's a bipartisan effort, but its sheer size and scope led to some political concessions to help get the bill passed. And that included having child care provisions as well as project labor agreements, which made it a little more controversial. The CHIPS program office is continuing, but its future is a bit uncertain. Next. So these preceding efforts show, we've used industrial policy through appropriations in significant amounts since 2020, and they've had an impact. But there are two clear limitations to significant use of appropriations to achieve industrial-based goals. The first is that the larger investment of public funds, the greater chance these investments get caught up in political considerations, which makes their stick-to-itiveness challenging. And the second limitation is there simply isn't enough money to fix all the industrial-based weaknesses. $52 billion sounds like a lot, but in the microelectronics world, they will say that's just getting going. That's just table stakes. So, and there's just not an appetite for another chips anywhere on the horizon, doing large scale public sector industrial based investment programs, given public sector deficits in the absence of a major war. There's also kind of no appetite for perpetual government subsidies in some competitive areas. So chips, in my view, is likely the peak of industrial policy and large-scale use of appropriated funds for industrial-based kind of improvements. So that's where the private capital comes in. But I'm going to divert just for a minute and talk about how private capital got more involved. The focus on innovation for the past decade plus has led to efforts such as Defense Innovation Unit, or DIU, AFWorks, the increase of public-private partnerships like the Manufacturing Innovation Institutes, the growth of the consortia from 1 to over 40, NXTXL, a lot of these. And in these you have private sector, you have traditional companies, you have startups, you have companies that are backed by venture capital, companies backed by private equity, and then you have academic institutions and the like. And so these have gotten companies from lots of different stripes more involved. And another way they do that innovation is through the SBIR program, which has grown in the past decade, as you can see, to almost $6 billion a year across the U.S. government. About equal parts are defense and then non-defense. However, SBIR and SITR, I mean, they have small initial kind of awards in phase one. And transitioning across the Valley of Death is often a challenge with SBIR as well. But there's some promising efforts, the StratFi, TACFi efforts in AFWorks that have started getting private capital more engaged. So next. All right, and so but the point is this innovation really has had a big impact. You see OTs, it's a big priority for the current administration, but the fact of the matter is between 2018 and 2023, the last two administrations, OTs have increased 220% to almost $16 billion a year in that period. Now, but the fact of the matter is OTs are focused on prototyping. They do have follow-on production OTs, but the amount that we've done on those is very, very small. So this is where the increased deployment of private capital could have a major impact to help transition that innovation to production. Next. So here are a few ideas that we should be considering for getting the private new models for capital markets and defense. One, the fact of the matter is that the power of U.S. capital markets is one of our major competitive advantages in the global marketplace. We have a dominant position in the capital markets globally. And there's been increased private sector investment in defense through private equity and venture capital funds in the last several years. So, and in recognizing that, the Department of Defense, for the first time in several decades, created a loan authority through the Office of Strategic Capital to help companies kind of invest in defense. Now, initially, I was skeptical about this effort, but I've totally come around and recognized that the importance of private capital, because government investment is important. There is private capital money to get these things started, but scaling is where the challenge comes in. And OSC did their initial funding opportunity earlier this year. They only have $1 billion in loan authority, and they had over $9 billion in credit applications. So, there's signaling that they're looking to do another round of OSC investment, and there's also other ways to do this. The DPA has existing loan guarantee authority, has not been used in 50 years. But so that's a potential. And then President Trump signed an executive order looking at establishing a sovereign wealth fund, which may or may not be a model for us. So next, two efforts that can be done in short order would be to help build recurring demand in that key market signal. Because multi-year procurement is not very kind of something that Congress does very reluctantly, but we can do it through purchase commitments, which are a DPA authority, or establishing a loan guarantee program. On purchase commitments, all that needs to be done is you need to appropriate DPA funds for no-year money. So you could set up a 10-year kind of purchase commitment for critical minerals or for other areas. The loan guarantee program would be helpful against scaling investment. And likewise, accelerating depreciation would be a way to help traditional companies, VC and PE companies make bets or make investments to scale. Instead of buying back stock, buy more capacity to produce munitions. And having that buy down of risk through accelerated depreciation. And this is one of the features of the reconciliation bill potentially. And finally, a medium-term effort is on changing margin incentives. If you really want to change how companies behave, you create more margin opportunities and you'll see more investment, full stop. Right now, that's governed a lot of this by cost accounting standards and the like, so we have to change that, but it's the right opportunity to do that. So in conclusion, next slide. So the way ahead, industrial policy efforts have strengthened the defense industrial base, but the spirits of chips and other large appropriation-based efforts have made it clear that we are at, or frankly likely beyond peak industrial policy. It's time to move beyond these large-scale industrial policy efforts on appropriations and put the tremendous power of our capital markets to work. Each of these models that I described need additional development to determine their feasibility and use cases. And the key with all these is they address the metrics on which companies, that's traditional, private equity, and venture capital firms, are evaluated by their investors and shareholders. And if we do that and address these incentives, we will spur the level of private capital investment we need to address today's and tomorrow's challenges. I look forward to your questions in the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Really appreciate that. Over to you, Stephanie. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dinesh. What a pleasure for Anna Kim and I to join you today to discuss our research paper. Special shout out to the Center for Government Contracting at George Mason University, as well as the Emerging Technologies Institute and National Defense Industrial Base, Industry Association, NDIA, for co-publishing this paper. I'd like to recognize the research team. We have Dr. Arun Serafin, myself, Jacob Wynn, and Anna Kim. Finally, I'd like to highlight the participation of the industry members of ETI and NDIA who really made this paper possible. Without them, we wouldn't have been able to come to the conclusions and best practices and the recommendations for the way forward. Since we've released this paper in February, we've had tremendous response to the new insights and the actionable recommendations, and we look forward to continuing to work with Congress, with DoD, and industry to truly leverage the power of prototyping. With all that said, I'd like to turn the mic over to my partner in crime, Anna Kim, to share some highlights of the paper. Anna, over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. And next slide, please. So I'm Anna Kim. I'm a researcher at NDIA's Emerging Technologies Institute. We work to provide research and education on the development and integration of emerging technologies for defense. And that mission is really what drove this report. So nearly all technologies prototype during their development lifecycle. This is a resource, funding, and labor-intensive process. So the questions we set out to ask and answer here were things like, are we making sure that we're getting a full ROI on all of this investment into prototyping? Are we appropriately and accurately capturing the knowledge and benefits produced by these activities? What are the pain points here in this process? Where are they, and how do we try to address them? And then how do we know if we're succeeding on these fronts? One other thing I want to highlight here is that prototyping can also be very time intensive. There's been a lot of focus recently from the administration and Congress on speed. We've seen executive orders and reforms all centered around accelerating technology acquisition. So with that in mind, this work is also about how can we prototype more quickly or effectively or efficiently to better serve efforts to field new technologies at speed. So next, I'll briefly talk about our methodology. It's laid out here in the slide. Our goal for this research was really to have broad representation across government, academia, and industry, and especially to reach a diversity of size, organization type, and sector within industry. One of the big benefits of doing research as NDIA is that it provides unique access to industry. We try to draw heavily on our membership base as part of our methodology for reports like this one. And the number one focus of this paper really was to get unique industry input on this issue, and we did that through workshops and interviews and surveys. Next slide, please. So one of our goals here was to capture why does prototyping matter and what is its value? And when you talk about those questions, something you hear commonly is that prototyping is all about failing in order to learn. So the simple acquisition of knowledge. There are some others listed here that we also find important and valuable. Some are more obvious than others. But when you're thinking about what the value of prototyping is, you come to how do we define a successful prototype or a successful prototyping activity? What's interesting is this is something we asked industry, and the results are here on this chart to the right. We asked, what do you define as success in prototyping at your organization? And we found that industry first defines success as integration with an existing system. As an example of this, we held an event recently actually to roll out the findings of this report. And one of our speakers talked about a prototype sensor they were building and how they were initially worried about issues like AI integration or signal detection until they went to test it in Finland. And they got feedback there from Marines they were working with on things like, it's just too heavy to carry around, or it doesn't work in negative 10-degree weather in Finland. And those things were critical to its development. So that's an interesting case of how prototyping can serve that first bullet. Next on our chart is transitioning to a program of record. You'll note that these are both very concrete outcomes. And then way at the bottom, the least popular response was the prototype failed, but we learned something valuable. So industry does not define success as furthering knowledge, which is really interesting because when you look at government documents, for example, we looked at DoD's prototyping guidebook. That definition leans heavily towards acquiring knowledge as an ends unto itself. So there's this large disparity here in the conceptualization of success when it comes to prototyping between government and industry, which is a really key pain point to understand, especially when forming best practices, which I'll talk about on the next slide. So here you can see the list of best practices we identified for prototyping for both industry and government, and I'll focus on just a couple of these. First, I want to call your attention to the chart on the side. So we asked, please rank what is important to you in a contract for successful prototyping. And far and away, the first choice is ability to communicate with the customer on requirements. It's not time to award, which is third, or ability to retain IP rights, which is fourth. And this ties directly to our first two bullets here, which are commitment and collaboration of resources and thoughtful requirements. So what that really means is both sides need to commit resources collaboratively. And that doesn't only mean physical resources like funding, but also time and attention required for effective communication, which is how you get to the collaborative development of thoughtful requirements that make sense to all stakeholders. Next, I'd like to talk about our fourth and fifth bullets here. These are digital acquisition and simple and open design, both good systems engineering practices. First, when we say digital acquisition, we mean more than just digital engineering. We think of it as digital models, digital twins, digital engineering, and also digital acquisition, so that it really represents a whole of life cycle approach that the prototype, quote unquote, lives digitally from start to finish. And then simple open systems, we're thinking of frameworks like MOSA, modular open systems architecture. These to me are linked, not because you necessarily have to do both just because you're doing one, but because both of these things represent more of an investment upfront to set up correctly. Something like MOSA in particular, you want to make sure that the framework you're developing makes sense for your system, but they can pay off dividends in labor and cost savings in the long run. They do things like provide more universal access to models, identify usability issues early on. All of those things can shorten development timelines and help reduce that resource burden that we've mentioned. Then to touch on our last bullet, prototyping iteratively. Digital engineering and acquisition and open systems help with this because they almost mandate that you capture knowledge and develop iteratively by nature of the architecture. On this point, there's sort of an extreme that could exist where no prototyping results are captured or shared, which lowers the likelihood of transition because if you're not sharing results, you could have all these well-intentioned activities that are eating up people's time and resources, but not necessarily leading to the results that you want to see. And then on the flip side, if you are prototyping iteratively, every prototype should build not only on itself and learn from itself, but it should also build the knowledge base of the defense community. Now, this depends pretty heavily on documentation and reporting as well, which leads me to the next slide. So finally, here are our recommendations for DoD, Congress, and industry. We've been collecting feedback on which of the report's recommendations are the most actionable, and so I want to highlight a couple that we're getting the most uptake on. First one I want to mention is our third bullet, leverage all readiness levels. So when you're thinking about DoD visibility into transitioning prototypes to programs of record or systems integration, one of the tools it can use to track this is TRLs or technology readiness levels. But in addition to that, there are all these other readiness level frameworks that DoD can and should be using in the planning and execution of prototyping activities. These include things like manufacturing readiness levels, software readiness levels, integration readiness levels. So we recommend that the Secretary of Defense actually establishes a process to integrate TRLs with these other readiness levels and report on those efforts, with the ultimate goal being to guarantee that research communities keep the entire acquisition lifecycle top of mind as they're working to transition these prototypes. Finally, I want to talk about our second and fifth recommendations in this list, which are measure success, evaluate outcomes, model successful organizations, and capture and share knowledge. Those are obviously linked. So in our paper, we call out some promising reporting structures that are already in place. For example, DIU actually produces an annual report where they not only define upfront what they define as a transitioned prototype, which is great, but then report on how many of their programs transitioned within the year. Unfortunately, this is more the exception than the rule. GAO tried to look at DARPA's prototyping activities in 2015, for example, but they found it was difficult to evaluate because DARPA doesn't track prototyping activities once they've left their program, which makes it hard to accurately track rates of transition. Even if this reporting exists, it can also be hard for industry to keep track of it and access it. So our recommendations in full are that DoD, one, establishes standardized criteria for assessing the success of prototyping efforts across the ecosystem. Second, that they require organizations that do prototyping to report annually based on these measures of success. And then finally, that they also create a repository or some other infrastructure to capture and disseminate this information. And the bottom line here is essentially senior leaders and other individuals do gain knowledge from prototyping activities currently, but those people turn over, or they're siloed, or they don't talk to each other, and that information can be lost. So what we want to make sure happens is that all of this investment put into prototyping pays off with an enterprise that is strengthened in service of the end user and national security. With that, we both want to thank NPS for the opportunity to talk about this work here. I would personally like to thank Stephanie for all of her support, and we're really looking forward to this conversation with Dinesh and the other panelists, and to generally continuing this conversation about the power of prototyping. With that, I'll turn it back over to Dinesh. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Really appreciate it. I think, as you know, if you have questions, please type them out into the Q&A under the Q&A button. I would appreciate it. We'll give precedence to the audience with regard to the questions, but certainly I have quite a few of my own for each of the three papers. But let's begin, Jerry, with the question that Greg is asking. How does the financial mechanism for minimum purchase guarantees work? I understand the benefits of the guarantees, but I'm hazy how it avoids scale limitations of multi-year procurement.
Well, I mean, there's two ways to do it. I mean, so for a purchase commitment, which is a DPA kind of authority, you're just, the government establishes an agreement that we're going to purchase this much of this kind of industrial-based capacity, that it be a specialty chemical or a critical mineral. That money is appropriated or set aside in the DPA fund for a period of years. And then, so that is money that is set aside that the companies can say, well, I can plan that's an opportunity for me to go after. And that, that kind of money is just kind of set aside by appropriation. The challenge is DPA money is generally colorless. That is, it doesn't expire. But the last several years, it's been appropriated as procurement dollars. So that expires in 2 years. So that's why they haven't done it. So purchase commitments are pretty straightforward, but it allows for the benefits of multi-year procurement, but you don't have to appropriate it all at once.
Thanks, Jerry. Wanted to ask Jim a question of you. Since all three presentations talked about prototyping, and not only talked about prototyping, but talked about prototyping and experimentation almost interchangeably. In your entry C and entry D, you talk to prototyping and experimentation. Could I request you to perhaps clarify for us what you see as similarities and differences between the notion of prototyping and the notion of experimentation?
Sure, great question. I'll start with my immediate answers and share the floor with Dr. Mayer to elaborate a little bit more if she likes. So off the bat, the way that we saw experimentation used in particular through the Agility Prime program is that they made arrangements with eVTOL firms, and the firms would supply the technology at no cost, and the Air Force would supply sort of testing platforms and equipment and things like that. And that was used to, again, through cooperative agreements, through arrangements to gather additional data and sort of test the platforms under conditions that the Air Force would expect them to operate, which is related but conceptually different from prototyping, where you either buy or acquire in one way the actual platform and then make adaptations to it to fit defense unique requirements. And so they're certainly related, and which is part of why they show up in the very center of that diagram, and part of why we're all talking about them constantly, especially with respect to adapting commercial technologies to military use. And then I do also know that there's a couple different guidebooks that the DoD publishes that I think probably lays it out in much more detail, the distinctions between the two.
Lauren, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, just one clarification and one note. Jim covered most of it. First, those pathways that we looked at were based specifically on policies and authorities, and so those terms that we used are based on the policies and authorities that are allowed, right? And so that also clarifies, at least it's related to policy. The other thing I will say, and I think Jerry made a point of this, that for prototyping, that actually can lead straight to some large scale production, but only in the case that you've completed the OT prototype first, and that has not been used a lot, whereas experimentation does not necessarily get you to that route. So you would still have to go through prototyping. Technicalities.
I appreciate that, Lauren. Thank you. Wonderful question from Art for all three. I'm including Jim and Lauren as one, and Stephanie and Anna as one also. So just the three presentations. I love this question. Could the panel comment on how we might prototype with enough momentum to jump the valley of death? I love the word momentum. Any thoughts that you all have on that?
Yeah, I can jump in here. So when you look at the best practices of prototyping in our paper, well, we didn't specifically call out the Valley of Death. We were thinking about that. And when we surveyed industry, they said, first and foremost, the successful prototype is one that's integrated into an existing weapon system. And based on that, the approach to prototyping, I think, is a little bit different when you think that, hey, we need to put that into an existing weapon system. And so a lot of times when people approach the Valley of Death, they want to create something that will then become its own program of record. And think that that is a very small segment of industry. Most of industry is actually thinking about, how do I integrate that into an existing weapon system? And with that in mind, you want to think about, how do we start from the beginning, integrating concepts of digital engineering, digital acquisition? How do we integrate open system design? How do we think about prototyping iteratively? So, what we're trying to jump the valley of death is not an end item, but is part of that journey to get across and get something into a weapon system. So I think there's a lot of concepts in our paper that touch on this, if you think about them in just kind of a little bit different way.
I really like the metaphor of momentum, Stephanie. How do we build enough momentum that increases the probability of success? So that was a really neat question. Anna, the next question is for you.
Well, can I pile on that
Sure,
one too?
go for it, Jerry. Sorry.
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is the key. I mean, I think for all the focus on OTs, the current administration, we, as I showed in my paper, I mean, we really have ramped up how we do prototyping, and same with Stephanie and Anna's paper. We've done that well, but the challenge now we've got is, how does that transition? It doesn't always have to be a program of record, but it's got to be, a capability that we can use. And that's part of that comes through budget reform. Part of that comes through, better kind of transitions through production OTs, following production OTs, or FAR-based contracts. But that is I think the real area that we need to focus on. I think the prototyping, we've got that now. I mean, we need to expand it, but it's like how does that go next? Not everything that prototypes is going to go forward, and it shouldn't. But the transition is not well kind of well oiled as it needs to be.
Thank you, Jerry.
I'd actually disagree that we have it down. We've doubled the amount of money that we've put towards prototyping in the last 20 years, yet we have no idea what the outcomes are. So if we have it down, there's no measurable way to say that we have it down. So I think that is transition is important, but I don't know that we have prototyping down yet either.
Yeah, well, I think we're in agreement in the sense that, I mean, I think we're doing prototyping now, but sort of what are the outcomes? Is it transition? Is it, just refining requirements? So I don't think we're in disagreement there. I just think we need to focus on, okay, what does the prototype lead to?
Actually, if we have time, we'll be able to get back to this topic a little bit later, Stephanie. Anna, there's a question for you. The question is, did your study show that successful prototype transition had a focus on manufacturing readiness as part of its initial assumptions?
Yeah, I think one thing we didn't get to cover, but that is covered in the paper, is that idea of building manufacturing capability. We mentioned workforce development. We also mentioned building that capacity. And to expand more on that, I think part of the idea of a core benefit that prototyping provides is this idea that not only are engineers and designers, the people actually building things, getting experience from working on these systems, but you're also able to put prototypes into the hands of the user or the warfighter and get feedback and work out manufacturing and interoperability issues before actual use, which can be crucial. So along those lines, I think, yes, it's less something that came up in industry responses when they thought about successful prototypes, but more of a crucial benefit that comes along with prototyping, in addition to the failing fast and the learning fast and everything associated. Stephanie, anything I missed?
I was thinking, Stephanie, Anna, what do you think about the idea that thinking about manufacturability may be an aspect of building momentum for the prototyping effort, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, one of the things that Anna did cover in her presentation was the focus on all readiness levels. And so manufacturing readiness level is key, is called out specifically in the paper, as well as sustainability readiness levels. And so when you think about prototyping, most people only want to talk about technology readiness levels. Yet there's this whole other composite of readiness levels that should be considered if we want to, as Jerry said, make that jump, make that transition from prototype into production.
Before Greg, before we get to your next question, I had a question for you, Jerry, and then I'll ask the others to respond if they have an interest in it. And I'm going to read a few excerpts from your paper, which I found devastating for the primes. There was under your research question section, you talked about how there have been appeals for increased company spending on IRAD instead of stock buybacks to co-invest, cost share, commercialize strategies, etc. And then a little bit later in the paper, you talk about smaller publicly traded companies do not typically buy back shares because they see significant defense and national security opportunities in their market segments, perhaps relating to unmanned systems, advanced electronics, and autonomy. If similar incentives existed for the larger primes, this is where their capital would go.
Yeah.
I mean, if I'm a prime, that's devastating that they don't find opportunity or they're not thinking of investing in what the future of war might look like or the conflict might look like. Any thoughts on how we can go beyond just pleas to cause a change in behavior in some of the primes, Jerry?
Yeah, no, a great question. Yeah, and I did a separate op-ed with a couple of colleagues on this specific issue of stock buybacks, and it really comes down to, like I said in the presentation, that Lockheed and the big companies, it's only about 100 companies that are publicly traded, and only about half of those do stock buybacks, and they're the bigger primes, and they do it because they have to, that's the best use of their kind of free cash flow. There aren't big enough opportunities for them to make other investments, either CapEx or the like, that where they're not building two tanks. They're not building kind of enough scale for those companies that they can make investments that are better than the use of capital to buy back stock. In the cases of like Kratos and AeroVironment and so on, all the services are investing so much in unmanned systems, so much in autonomy, that they can invest less in stock buybacks and more to doing IRAD and things like that, because their market areas are so hot. So the way to get after it for the bigger primes is doing things like changing depreciation rates, creating kind of offtake agreements, things that enable them to make bets and use their money in different ways. So that's kind of how and that's why I focus not just on private equity and venture capital, but on traditionals too, because we need to get everyone more invested, and the private capital is how that's going to be done. And that's some of the ways we can get the traditionals kind of investing more as well.
Any thoughts from any of the other panel members? Okay. In that case, again, before we take Greg's question, Stephanie, I had a question for you after reading your paper. There's so many different ways we might go about doing prototyping. I mean, today you can have physical prototypes, you can have computational prototypes. These prototype efforts can have so many different objectives. And you also alluded to, and I think, Jim, you alluded to how there is disagreement across various guidance documents with regard to how they define prototyping, perhaps experimentation objectives, et cetera, et cetera. Does it make sense for there to be some sort of a framework to help conceptualize the different approaches to prototyping and the diversity of objectives? Did you find anything like this in your research? Any thoughts you have in this regard, Stephanie?
Thanks, Dinesh. You're absolutely right. There are so many different ways to prototype. And in the paper, we highlight that there's over 300 innovation organizations across the Department of Defense. And all of them are doing some sort of prototyping in a different way. And so one of the things that we talk about in the paper is that, you know, they don't all have the same goals. They don't all have the same mission, but they aren't communicating those very well. And then they're not measuring themselves to the mission and what their goals are. So, you know, part of that probably should also be they need to come up with a framework. And then those organizations that operate in a similar type framework can start comparing themselves against each other, leverage best practices, and move forward. So, you know, your question was, should there be a framework to think about? Yes, but I would say frameworks. And part of that framework is what we were trying to identify as the best practices of any framework, not just one framework, but any framework that was developed. The best practices in our paper are those things that should be included in those frameworks. Anna, did you have anything to add?
No, I completely agree.
Thanks.
So one thing that you know, Jerry's paper was a bit more strategic, you know, as he was looking at the defense industrial base, and Jim, you and Lauren got a little bit more into wave points, entry points that become perhaps a bit more tactical, and then of course Stephanie, Anna, Arun's paper gets into aspects of prototyping, derived benefits, or at least perceived derived benefits, and so on and so forth. One thing that I was missing in all the discussions around prototyping and perhaps experimentation was this notion of abstraction levels. Jim, particularly, I wanted to ask you this question. Often when you use the word technology, in my mind, whether explicitly or implicitly, I equated this to a system solution. Sometimes a commercial solution may not be at a system level. It might be quite a bit lower in abstraction level, where I might use commercial technology in the context of a bespoke development, for example. But you didn't get into those abstraction levels. Could you talk a bit about that?
I'm glad you picked up on that. And I was on the fence about using the word technology when I described eVTOLs. I often tacked on technology right behind eVTOL as a shorthand. And I'd like to tie in a little bit of I think it was Clark's question, going back to the specific sort of building momentum around prototyping. I think it's important to acknowledge that prototyping varies depending in part on what type of technology you're working with. In the case of our paper, we were looking at a commercial technology, pretty much exclusively commercial technology. eVTOLs, they are off to the races in the commercial markets. And so they're designed for short haul, urban air mobility. There's thoughts of using them for small scale logistics, automating them. And so when you shop that platform around, I'll use the word platform instead of technology here. When you shop that platform around with folks in the Air Force, they're like, oh yeah, that's cool. It operates on batteries. It has vertical takeoff or landing capabilities. But then you look at the performance and you start to see, well, the range isn't quite there. I'm not sure if it's got the secure communications capabilities. The payload, I'm not quite sure about the payloads. Are there requirements that this platform actually fulfills? So going back to this question of prototyping kind of depends on what you're looking at, but also when we're talking about momentum, you need to apply an initial force to get that momentum going. And so in the case of eVTOLs, we're looking at, this is what the commercial sector is providing. Now, what are the limitations that we need to start working around when we're prototyping to make a case that, hey, maybe this does fill an existing capability gap, or maybe it illuminates an area that the military could start looking at to provide a new capability. And that's a highly uncertain area, but we won't know if we don't start actually toying around with the platform itself. Again, avoiding the use of the term technology. And one of the side questions here is, as the commercial market develops further, does the military then become, because they play a very small share in the market, does the military then become less able to get what it needs out of that platform or technology when it ultimately comes around?
So I think given your response, Jim, Greg's next question is pretty relevant. He's asking, how important do you view the qualification or conformance process to prototyping? Is that distinct from more traditional development approaches, particularly when you compare commercial with perhaps DoD use, right? So how important is it? How important do you view the qualification or conformance process to prototyping?
I'm looking at the question and I'm getting a little bit lost in it, to be honest. Maybe there's another way of framing.
So the way and if I'm wrong, Jim, please chime in. The way I thought of Greg's question was not too dissimilar from the question earlier with regard to manufacturability. The idea that you're thinking about how you might go through qualification, how you might do certification perhaps of that technology or that solution. How important is that to make it an inherent part of the prototyping effort? Hopefully, I
Uh,
got that right, Greg.
so some of that is ringing a bell, and I wasn't. I know another part of our team worked closely on those processes. So I would have to. I can take your name down, Mr. Sanders, and maybe get back to you after pointing out a spot or two in our report. And maybe Dr. Mayer, something else might come to mind for you.
Yeah, I think one thing I wanted to say related to that, in the case of Agility Prime and eVTOL, they actually, the Air Force actually worked with these eVTOL companies to place them through airworthiness certification ahead of actually the FAA, for instance, having those certifications in place for these types of platforms. And I think related to importance here, I almost want to flip it on its axis and say, in terms of Agility Prime gave the industry the ability to show airworthiness certification within DoD ahead of the commercial sector. And so I think that there is a level of importance for that qualification, and DoD can actually play a role in that for the broader industrial base. I know, and I'll leave it at that.
Can I,
Go
can I
ahead, Jerry.
jump in? Yeah, I mean, I think qualification, I think is it's an area that's covered actually in the Forged Act, that's under consideration on the Hill. And I mean, the idea of in the Forged Act is to try to get to much kind of streamlined efforts at certification and qualification, because it is a huge time component for I think would less in the prototyping phase and more in kind of production, kind of final kind of LRIP and the like for parts and systems. So I would hope that that we do sort of the minimum needed for prototyping and streamline kind of the take the approach of the Forged Act because qualification it's another kind of part that sort of delays kind of how systems get to the field. Got to protect the soldier, protect all that stuff, but we need to relook how we do those efforts.
I agree, and I think Greg, that was a terrific question that I think may be an impedance factor that requires us to deal with some creativity, like Jerry's alluding to, in order not to become such a big hurdle for commercial companies to try and engage, with the DoD space. Go ahead, Stephanie.
Yeah. So we kind of touched on this two places in our paper. The first, we talked about best practices with regards to thoughtful requirements. And what we mean by thoughtful requirements is to include from what you design and the
How you
needs there,
certify and how you certify, maybe.
as well as certifying and testing. Absolutely. So, we had an example of one person that we interviewed, and they talked about they were doing some hypersonic work, and the requirements that came down to them for their hypersonic work were based on space shuttle technology. And they said, come on now, like we're a little bit farther ahead of this. Like we don't need to be meeting space shuttle technology. In the same respect, when we think about prototyping, and this is going to be a big lift for the military, for DoD, initially a lot of this technology was developed when there wasn't commercial technology around. And so military standards were required because there was no other standard. But now, as technology has been adopted in the commercial market, and sometimes the commercial market is leading that technology, standards really are the best and most well-developed internationally, not in the DoD. And so, DoD folks that are designing and doing prototyping need to start migrating to international standards and really only using military standards as an exception. So those are two things that we covered in our paper that I think go to Greg's question.
I appreciate that, Stephanie. Maybe the last question that remains unanswered in the Q&A panel that we received. Stephanie and Anna, this I think goes to you. Pete, you're alluding to the fact that DCTC was invoked in the paper as a successful prototype program. Can you elaborate on why you're saying that? And then, of course, Pete has a few other nice words to say about the program. Over to you, Stephanie and Anna.
Yeah, absolutely. So Pete, if you would reach out to me afterwards, I'd like to get you in contact with the folks at DCTC because I see that you're at a DevCom and there might be some overlap and ways for you guys to partner with DCTC. So Defense Civilian Training Corps, DCTC, yeah, great program focused on developing the skills of the next generation of the civilian DoD workforce. So it's an ROTC-like program designed at 4 universities, as you pointed out in your question right now. It is already expanding. I don't know the other universities offhand, so we can get back to you on that. But it's interesting, when the DCTC program was first designed and thought about, it was really focused on like, we need more systems engineers in the Department of Defense. We need more hypersonics engineers. So it's very functional. But as all of these incredibly brilliant people have been working and implementing DCTC, they've really moved it to like, it needs to be skills-based. We don't need hypersonic engineers. We don't need systems engineers. We do. Okay, so don't quote me on that. But what we really need is we need people with critical skills, critical thinking. We need people that are collaborative and will work in teams. We can teach them all these other things that they might need to know. But we need those type of skills. And so DCTC is really focused on that. The prototyping part that I alluded to in the paper is about how the DCTC students spend their summers at a innovation organization like a DevCom, and they work on a multi-functional team on a existing prototyping project that the organization is actually using in its process. So it's not some made up prototyping. And then they work on it and turn that over to the organization. So with all that said, I'm super excited about DCTC as well. And Pete, if you'll reach out to me, I actually screenshotted your name as well. We're going to connect you with the people that I think there'll be more collaboration on that. So.
Thank you, Stephanie. I wish we had more time. I can't believe I'm saying this. I wish we had more time because I do have a ton more questions I could have asked. I certainly prepared those questions. I'm grateful to all of you for being members of this panel and for the papers you wrote. It was interesting reading for me over the last 2 or 3 days. Thank you so much to NPS for organizing this symposium and for letting me be a small part of it.